We've had some presentations. We're going to have a panel discussion now. Just a group of participants and a moderator. So the panel discussion is about aniridia as a symptom or spectrum, hinders and barriers for cross-European clinical management guidelines. So this is a very important topic. We do have a couple of folks here that are experts in this area, and again, I'm glad to do it, navigate it myself, but is Dr. Lauderdale, I just saw him a few minutes ago, is he here for this session, or is he, so we can start, I'm glad to do it, or Neil, if you'd like to lead on. Okay, let me introduce a couple of the panelists then. We're really thrilled that Dr. Dominique Bremond-Gignac, I've really messed up the last part of the name, Gignac, Sophie, is here with us. And she is a true expert in this area. Erlend, Landsend, who you've heard from earlier, is also an expert in this area. The guidelines vary across Europe, but those are experts. And also I'd like to call up Dr. Sophie Valleix here as well. Yes, in genetics, but also an expert as well in this area, because part of this links in with should we use genetics and guidelines. So I'm just going to open up with a comment, and then there's Dr. Lauderdale. I don't know if you're aware, but you are moderating, and while you're preparing to moderate, he's going to have to separate us and keep us from fighting too much, I guess. But before we start, I just wanted to make a couple of comments about this. I think to give you the reasons maybe behind this session, guidelines are important. Guidelines in Europe determine many things. One of the things that they determine is where does funding go? How do we get funding for various things? That's determined oftentimes for guidelines. Guidelines vary across Europe and in the United States. We're having battling speakers here, so I'm going to get away from that other microphone here. We have guidelines that vary in different parts of the world. And sometimes they're not concordant. Sometimes there's some disconnect between the guidelines. How do we resolve those? And then there are, but I think importantly, things like how do patients get reimbursed for diseases? If let's say that Dr. Lauderdale's comments about hearing and sensory disorders and various other neurological issues are part of aniridia, what does an insurance company do now when you bring in that claim to say that my child's hearing issues and sensory disabilities should be paid for because it's part of a disease condition called aniridia? Right now, it doesn't get paid for because they don't really think of that as being part of aniridia. So then the other related questions are here, and Dr. Lauderdale will guide us through them. But that's why I wanted to mention that I think that this session is important. It was well conceived, and we'll have some comments from all the panelists. Dr. Lauderdale.
Thank you. So is aniridia a syndrome or a spectrum?
Thank you,
Let's start discussing. Actually, are you moderating too, Dominique? Okay, so I'm the only moderator.
It's a pleasure.
Boy, this is embarrassing.
We all have opinions, though. We all have opinions.
Dominique, would you be kind enough to share your thoughts on whether aniridia is a syndrome or a spectrum?
Well, that's a very complicated question because, of course, when you just look at the title, you say aniridia, so you think it's only anomaly of the iris. And for sure, there is a binocular disease. And more this, there is also diabetes. There is also a problem of olfactory problems. There is also, you demonstrate also, there is brain problems. So it's very complicated to say it's only ocular. And even if most of them are probably ocular limited, there is quite a part which is including other systemic anomalies. So that's why it could be more than just a spectrum. It could be a syndrome, including all these diseases. But I don't know if you have the same idea of what I just telling you, because for a long time it was just a problem of aniridia. And there was nothing to say that there was also foveal hypoplasia, which is quite more common than aniridia and PAX6 mutation. And also something is when you say congenital aniridia, you must consider this is only PAX6 mutation congenital aniridia. Because of course we have seen, like in glaucoma, we can have many patients which are aniridia and glaucoma and congenital glaucoma, and the mutation is not PAX6, it's CYP1B1 or FOXC1 or even something else. And so that's just what I think, but it will be a pleasure to listen to you for Erlend if you want to do it.
Yeah, thank you. I agree that we can use the term syndrome. I think that's correct, but there is a knowledge gap. There's a lot we don't know, but you have added a lot to that research, and I'm impressed by your results, and especially about brain anomalies and neurological disease. So I think, but we need larger trials and more to say, especially about hormonal disease. I think the pancreas, for instance, the function. I think we need more studies about pancreas, the hormone status of these individuals. So I think there's a lot to do on these fields. And you mentioned diabetes, that the course of diabetes in Aniridia is not the same as in other patients with diabetes type 2 or type 1. What is the difference? I think if you look at an obesity, for instance, is it just because of low vision, or is it metabolic changes, or insulin, or what is actually what's the causes? I think there's a huge knowledge gap, and until then, maybe it's more correct to use the term spectrum. But I think it's useful so far to use syndrome. So yeah.
Okay, so I'm now grounded. So what's in a term, right? Why are we even debating these two words that for all intents sound very similar, one to the other? And you just very nicely switched between the two. So what's the clinical, let's start with what a definition is. So what is the clinical definition of a syndrome? And how is it different than a spectrum?
Okay. I looked it up. Okay. A spectrum. They are actually fairly synonymous. I mean, you can use them somewhat interchangeably. Spectrum has been used more commonly for things like, I think, I'm trying to think of some examples, autism spectrum, where things that were thought to be separate from autism are suddenly are known now to be part of it as we've added in things. So you can be straight autism, you can be autism spectrum, which includes these other things that have been added into the collective understanding of what might involve at least some patients with this condition. Syndrome is kind of like, you know already there's certain things that are part of it, and you can call it a syndrome if it involves more than just the one thing. Aniridia, I agree totally with Dominique. Aniridia is lack of an iris. It's more than that. We all know that. So I think, syndrome is a very appropriate term. The challenge becomes when you have relatively low frequency things that are still strongly associated with aniridia, then you may consider using the term spectrum. But essentially they're fairly synonymous, and I think the basic challenge that we have as clinicians is that we all realize that the term aniridia is deficient. The WAGR group, Dr. Lauderdale and I just went through writing a paper, I think it was about the WAGR and vision, how much more severely affected people with WAGR are with visual disabilities. In that paper, we used the term WAGR spectrum because we were triggered by the WAGR group, Shari and Kelly and others, who had written a previous paper based on the CORDS database and argued that we should use the term WAGR spectrum in the literature. And so the term WAGR spectrum may be more appropriate now to use than just plain old WAGR. One of the problems that we have also, and I'd love to open this up to get your comments too, is that, NIH has argued for a genetic-based definition of WAGR. They say that's, in their actual website, they say, well, that's the 11p deletion syndrome. That's what it is to them. So you can really reduce it down to a genetic diagnosis and say, well, I mean, WAGR is, well, who cares what the findings are clinically? It's when you do the genetics, you find out that it's an 11p deletion syndrome. So that's the challenge that we have. And then I've also investigated how do we, is there some central source of the definition of terms, and we can all kind of relax because there really isn't. We don't have to decide today. But what happens is, NIH itself will put it on their website, and all of us say we're still going to use the term Wagner syndrome or Wagner, whatever we want to use. In the papers, if you write the second paper, when somebody else has used the term Wagner spectrum, it's easy to justify it, and you can just do it. So as authors, we have to decide in ourselves first. I think because there's no single rule providing source of what you call it. And so we have to decide for papers, we have to decide whether we go by the NIH recommendations, we have to decide whether we go by the guideline recommendations. But one thing that I would suggest that we consider doing, is as groups, we have the good fortune today to have ANA people here, AAE people here. We have some groups that are very influential. And so if we do collectively decide what sort of terms we should use and shouldn't use, that would have some influence. I would say it would be nice, from my viewpoint, to move away from the term aniridia to describe the disease, because we now know that the PAX6 mutations are associated with many other things. Aniridia spectrum makes sense, Wagner spectrum makes sense, Wagner syndrome makes sense, aniridia syndrome makes sense. But I think that we can maybe collectively try to have an influence, and at least if we harmonize our thinking on this, that would be very helpful. That's my comment.
Can I hold you for 1 second, Doc? Can you hold the Doc? Because I'm going to pull Beth in for just 1 second, because we have another viewpoint.
Yeah, just James.
I'd like to build and slightly adjust my thinking around what Peter just said. So syndrome requires multiple organ systems to be involved. So autism is never called a syndrome because only the brain is considered involved.
Right.
So aniridia, once you are sufficiently convinced that something other than the eye is involved in the disease, automatically becomes a syndrome, and that's the word. And I think what we see in the literature is the gradual movement towards that. But some are more convinced than others about how statistically significant these numbers are and whether it's appropriate to compare to the general population, etc. But once the field decides more than one organ system's involved, it's a syndrome. Spectrum is different. So autism is a spectrum. Up until now, we haven't used that word for aniridia, but we could begin to. And that's different. That's between individuals of the species. So a spectrum is you all have the same mutation in the same gene. It's defined originally from cystic fibrosis, where it was exactly the same mutation in all the humans, and yet the humans looked different. It became a spectrum. So if it's a spectrum because everybody has a different mutation, it's still acceptable to call it that, but it's a little bit different, and that would be our case. So you could easily make the argument that today aniridia is both a syndrome and a spectrum because of that variability between humans. And we know even the same mutation in two different humans can be different. So I think it meets even the stringent criteria. I would like to propose that we begin to name the disease. It's hard to throw away aniridia, but by itself, people will use it for someone who had a car accident and lost their iris. It's very confusing in the literature. I would like to hyphenate the gene involved with aniridia. This group of patients that I'm studying are PAX6 aniridia. No, they're 90% PAX6 aniridia, but I've added 10% of other, and I would hyphenate the gene so it becomes much clearer to the reader what was included and what was excluded. And somebody who had a car accident wasn't used in this particular study for that reason. So I build that on Duchenne's on muscular dystrophy, which was Duchenne's and this and that, and is now completely redefined as muscular dystrophy gene X. I think we should do the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Yeah, great comment. Sophie mentioned
Thank you very
that.
much.
Yeah.
No, it's
And
perfect.
Dominique.
I agree with Elizabeth. I think thank you very much, because I really think we can go on syndrome. And even if there is a genetic and phenotype variability, because it's quite the same for all the genetic rare eye diseases. So I really think syndrome is appropriate. The difference between Wager syndrome or Wager, spectrum, is because the mutation, the deletion is not the same. It could be a larger deletion. And so what we can observe is sometimes different. Because I have a special patient, she had ELX4 and ETX2 included in the deletion, which is completely different. So that's why I think in this case could be spectrum. But I really think that if we would like to do something that could be for all, it could be congenital aniridia PAX6 related. So it will exactly say what it is, and it could be a syndrome. That's just what I think. But it's so difficult to define exactly because there is so many differences, and there is, of course, congenital aniridia PAX6 related without any other systemic problems. So that's why it's quite complicated.
Yeah, and that's a great comment, and Beth's comment was great too. One of the things that, sometimes I look at is the medical coding, because they seem to always be one step ahead of us. And so whenever I have a patient that might need an artificial iris, for example, who has traumatic aniridia, that's actually easy decision for us to make. Many times they need it. It's more controversial, as you'll hear about in this meeting, with congenital aniridia. But for medical coding, they do have a different code for traumatic aniridia versus congenital aniridia. And I like that comment, that you make, Dominique, because it's kind of a general term that does encompass some of these small variations that are very difficult to sort out. We don't have a different name for every minor genetic variation. In my view, I'm not a geneticist, but I do think that it's a bit limiting if we just, the NIH definition of Wager is a bit limiting. 11p deletion syndrome, that's a bit limiting. So in the medical billing, it's just, traumatic aniridia and congenital aniridia. So there's a nice simplicity to that, but that may not be encompassing enough of what we want to say. Maybe congenital aniridia syndrome or something like that. Yeah.
Maria?
Thank you, Peter. Mariam.
Hello, everyone. That's a really interesting debate. Just my viewpoint, it crosses with Elizabeth and some of what has been said. So, to me, without doubt, aniridia is a syndrome. PAX6, we know, is expressed in various tissues of the body. It causes developmental defects in those different organs of the body. Sometimes the presenting feature is obviously the eye features, and it's whether or not we're investigating our patients well enough to identify whether they have, for example, structural brain anomalies or early pre-insulin glucose intolerance states, for example. Hopefully you'll hear more in my talk tomorrow, which will give some more biochemical evidence towards these features. But I would say definitely syndrome. When I think of spectrum, it's more clinical spectrum, but the diagnosis is a syndrome. And then with regards to the gene-based classification, I also think that's a good idea, because if we look at, for example, the inherited retinal dystrophies, retinitis pigmentosa, 102 different genes that contribute to that, we are now moving away from a clinical umbrella term that just describes a phenotype to more of a gene-based classification. And then if we think about aniridia in that sense, we can say that PAX6 aniridia syndrome affects various organs, but for example, FOXC1 will have a different expression pattern in the body and lead to maybe different phenotype, but still have the ocular features. But it isn't actually a PAX6 aniridia syndrome, because it won't give you, for example, the diabetes or maybe the brain anomalies. So I think there's worth in combining an element of a gene-based classification with the syndrome, and then the individual presents with a clinical spectrum.
Thank you. Very good too.
Looks like we just solved that problem.
Yeah, easy, very easy.
Sorry, go.
It's just a comment. If you have some genes, for instance ELP5, which is closely connected to PAX6 and regulates PAX6 how do you manage? It's not actually PAX6, but then you have another gene affecting PAX6 and may give the same phenotype.
For me, that would fit into PAX6 Aniridia syndrome, because any of the regulatory elements that are affecting PAX6, the ultimate result is PAX6 haploinsufficiency. But we're talking about the other genes that were mentioned that won't work in that similar pattern, that will still give congenital aniridia, but not with those other features of PAX6.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Deletions, right, 3' to PAX6 affect PAX6, and ELK4, well, it's important for other things, it would be more of an aniridia. It's definitely PAX6. And you could extend that on the other side all the way up to RCN, the gene that sits on the other side of that.
Just a little clarification, because in the context of this discussion, I would like to know, can we still speak about isolated aniridia? Because in what we can understand.
What type of aniridia? I'm sorry.
Isolated. Yes. Yeah, because during the years we use this terminology, but because of your great researches, now it's difficult to separate this one.
That's a good question, of course. What is very special in congenital aniridia PAX6 related is that there is many affected patients, people without systemic anomalies also. That's why we can talk about isolated congenital aniridia, including the panocular disease, which is complicated also, because if we just think it's just aniridia, you're not right, because there is panocular anomalies. And so when we talk about isolated congenital aniridia, it's because there is nothing outside the eye. And it is very complicated to be confirmed, because you need to make an extensive workup to be sure it's only that. But when you're adult, there is nothing else, and so you could say that's isolated. But it's not exactly a scientific name. I mean, it's when you say isolated, it's not exactly what we call in medicine. It's not recognized as a real term. So it's more to explain that there is only ocular anomalies. That's my point of view. I don't know what you think, Peter, or about that. Or
Yeah, I love the simplicity of that, and I think one of the things that I would comment for the guidelines, and again, I feel like the best thing for us to do is try to get some groups together and try to come up with some kind of consensus statement which may guide, for the future more effectively. I do think we have to add to the term aniridia in my view, but I would make a plea for in those groups as we discuss things and as we discuss things all together, that we try to keep it relatively simple. Because if we're guided by the exceptions to every rule, we'll never come up with anything that people want to use. We have to just think of the big picture and say this is generally speaking what's going on, and we do want to separate it from traumatic aniridia. I think that's a great point. But at the same time, there may be millions of little exceptions to everything, but we have to find a term that will encompass those without making it more complicated and difficult. So that's my only comment on that. But I think I agree with you, Dominique.
And we've got one more.
And we can say that's the last because we need to round up.
Yeah, I was just thinking from a clinician's point of view that, of course, ophthalmologists look at the eyes, but you really have to ask the patients about these problems, and always know that everything doesn't show immediately. I mean, if you could have a very long follow-up, a child, and then in the teens, maybe the obesity comes, and then the narcolepsia and so forth. Everything doesn't show immediately, so you have to always ask.
And with that, let's thank our panelists for an interesting discussion and the audience.